Today's topic is extreme environmentalism, or eco-terrorism. I've spoken elsewhere in the course about the growing critique of modernity, of modern science and technology. And there were many people who saw modern science and technology as a problem, but not so much of a problem that they needed to engage in extreme measures to solve the problems associated with the application of science and technology. There were some, however, who drew very radical and extreme, indeed revolutionary conclusions from the critique of modern science and technology, modern-day Luddites, you might say. And I want to talk about them today and the origins of these extreme environmentalists. Here you see an image of some graffiti, some vandalism, and you see ELF, which stands for Earth Liberation Front. It's a group that emerged in the 1970s. And they have splattered in painting this statement, "You cannot control what is wild." That becomes a kind of banner, that idea that we can't control what is wild, a kind of banner for the extreme environmentalist position that I'm going to talk about today. So let me talk a little bit about the origins of extreme environmentalism. In this course, we've traced out the conceit, the confidence that people had that science and technology would give us control, indeed dominance over Mother Nature, over the environment. I think this is embodied in the United States by Mount Rushmore, where we literally embed our claim that we control nature into nature itself. We put our political values into the mountainside and carve our dominance of nature into the physical environment in which we live. That idea becomes a foundation for modern civilization in many ways, and it's also the thing that upsets most these people I refer to as extreme environmentalists. They say that you can't do this. Nature is a kind of sacred temple. When you deface nature in this way, you have crossed a line, and in crossing that line, we're going to punish you. Now, what are the origins of this extreme environmentalism? A figure named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I talked about him with regard to Frankenstein. Frankenstein, in many respects, is a kind of exploration of Rousseau's ideas. They also, these ideas, become an inspiration for modern extreme environmentalists. Whether they know it or not, they're influenced by his ideas, as are most of us in our daily lives. One idea was the notion of a noble savage, and that is that modern sort of science and technology and civilization believes that people who live in a state of nature are savages and should be transformed into something more civilized. According to Rousseau, the people who live in nature are actually the ones that are pure and untainted, that we who live in civilization are the source of corruption. Modern civilization has tainted what is natural, what is, to use a modern term, organic. And we need to go back to a pre-modern way in order to capture something that's pure and meaningful and soulful. It's a basic idea at the core of Rousseau's thinking that many of these extreme environmentalists, as well as others, picked up on. Finally, the other notion that Rousseau had was the redemptive power of nature. So if we feel alienated by modern civilization, by the technologies that surround us, the way that we can get back in harmony and in touch with ourselves is by taking a walk in nature, retreating into nature. By the way, this is the foundation of the very idea of camping, of creating a national park system, that we feel like we can heal the wounds of modern existence and living by resting a little bit in the outdoors. It's a very modern notion, and it's something that comes in part out of Rousseau's ideas. So these are core ideas that this extreme environmentalists sort of run with, and then they draw very radical and, at times, violent conclusions. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson was key in the development of a kind of radical critique of modern science and technology. He himself was not, I think, you couldn't call him an eco-terrorist or a radical environmentalist, but he developed a critique that many later radical environmentalists would have agreed with. One of the things that he said was that man is ultimately good. Man in a state of nature, the Garden of Eden, so to speak, is pure and untainted. And that technology and modern civilization represents a kind of original sin. Again, this echoes and indeed was influenced by Rousseau's ideas. Also, along the lines of Rousseau, Emerson said that individuals are corrupted by organized religion and politics. We need the, if you drew the conclusion that some did, not necessarily Emerson, but some people concluded that if indeed organized religion and politics are responsible for corruption, then blow up organized religion and politics. That's the first step toward making the world a better place and getting back in touch with nature. Here's a picture of the old man, Ralph Waldo Emerson, inspiration for the School of Transcendentalism in the United States, which is really a kind of continuation of many of Rousseau's ideas that I talked about before. His famous book that was key and for many environmentalists and inspiration, called simply Nature, in 1836. And he said very succinctly, nature always wears the colors of the spirit. So spirit and soul are embedded within nature. By implication, things that are disconnected from nature are soulless and mechanical. Everything industrial and modern, in other words. One of Emerson's associates, Henry David Thoreau, developed an even more radical kind of critique of modern civilization, so much so that he said, you know what, I hate modern civilization so much, I just need to get away from human beings. I want to create a community that involves other animals, that involves plants and trees. By the way, he was a misanthrope. He really hated human beings, but he wanted to preserve for himself the right to create a community of other creatures and living beings, kind of like Dr. Dolittle speaking to the animals. So he holed himself up and isolated himself in Walden Pond, famously, and he wrote a book in the 1850s called Walden, Life in the Woods, all about his experience escaping from modern civilization and its supposed corruption in order to purify himself and get back in touch with what really makes a human being, and that is to say, being embedded within the natural world and figuring out how to live within that world. An inspiration for many college students and even high school students have to read Walden, Life in the Woods. And I know that when I grew up, many of my friends, including myself, very much influenced by Thoreau, to escape into the woods and to try to heal the wounds of modern society and civilization. He said here, famous quote, this is in On Walden Pond, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. So he really didn't feel like he could live unless he was experiencing life in the natural world. By implication, all those people who hadn't been in the natural world for a while really weren't living. They were just kind of zombies, you might say. And that was very much Thoreau's point of view, and the point of view of many who were inspired by him, including the extreme enviros that I'm going to talk about shortly. Rachel Carson, I've talked about her elsewhere. She also contributed to a growing critique that many radical enviros ran with, that the chemicals that we were using in our daily environment were killing us. They were killing us. Her book, Silent Spring, in 1962, thus became a kind of clarion call to changing the way that we relate to the natural world. Now, many used this critique and felt that, well, you know, it's right, that science and technology has led us astray, but that doesn't mean we can't correct how we do things. The people who believed that there was a solution within the modern scientific and technological system to the problems created by science and technology, we'll call them moderate environmentalists. They are part of the mainstream environmental movement now. They emerged in the 1960s and 70s. World Wildlife Federation, the Sierra Club, those who advocated for governments to endorse Earth Day, the Nixon administration, its creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, the Clean Water Act of 1972, the Endangered Species Act of 1973, curbside recycling. All of these are moderate solutions that suggest that there is a way to solve the problem of science and technology within the context of modern scientific and technological thinking. In other words, you don't need to start blowing stuff up to fix things. But there were others who believed, no, you need to start blowing things up to fix things. One of them, an inspiration for radical environmentalist, is a guy named Edward Abbey. who died in 1989. When I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s in particular, this was the sort of thing that zitty little kids read with glee, many of his works. He got a degree, master's degree in literature, and he wrote his master's degree at the University of New Mexico on anarchy and violence. So he's already thinking about violence as a particular instrument that you can use for making the world a better place. A revolutionary, in other words, who is willing, or at least thinking about, the need to have to blow things up to solve problems. In 1968, he did a modern-day Henry David Thoreau. He went into the deserts of Utah and he isolated himself. And he wrote a book based on that, his Walden Pond, called Desert Solitaire. It was all about this life in the desert alone and how wonderful it was to commune with nature in the desert, and conversely, how horrible it was that you had these people in these campers, you had these people in their cars, coming into this temple of the desert and profaning it. And he was committed to trying to keep people out of these pure environments, according to him. 1975, he wrote a work of fiction which was called The Monkey Wrench Gang, very popular for people that would later be termed eco-terrorists by the FBI after 9/11 in 2001. The Monkey Wrench Gang was a reference to 19th century Luddites in England and the United States who would throw wooden clogs into the machinery of textile machines in order to break them and ruin them. The people who did that were referred to as monkey wrenchers, hence the idea of throwing a wrench into the works, a monkey wrench. In this book, there are 4 monkey wrenchers who are hard drinkers, big partiers, fun-loving people, and what they do is they begin trying to sabotage modern civilization as it encroaches into the western desert. It's a couple quotes from Edward Abbey that indicate the way that he marries his sort of contemplation of violence as a way of solving problems to this growing critique of science and technology as a danger to the environment. Quote, notice in the background you see a nuclear power plant. Our modern industrial economy takes a mountain covered with trees, lakes, running streams, and transforms it into a mountain of junk, garbage, slime pits, and debris. And then he gives the finger to a nuclear power plant. I don't think you could state more succinctly his philosophy. A couple more quotes that indicate his radical sort of conclusions from the critique of science and technology. Quote, my job is to save the fucking wilderness. I don't know anything else worth saving. It's a radical position, obviously. Quote, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. It's the idea that we're consuming ourselves into oblivion. Quote, society is like a stew. If you don't stir it up every once in a while, then a layer of scum floats to the top. So here's a very radical critique of the destruction of the environment by modern science and technology, and someone who is making very radical conclusions. Nonetheless, Abbey himself did not transform his talk into action. Others, inspired in part by him, did. One of those is a guy named Theodore Kaczynski, an eco-terrorist and neo-Luddite. You're reading a screed that he wrote and had published in 1995 in the Washington Post, which is a radical critique of modern industry and society. And he not only had this radical critique of modern industry, science, and technology, but he acted upon it, becoming really one of the most famous eco-terrorists that has ever existed. So a little bit about Kaczynski and his acts of eco-terrorism and what he means in the context of this course. He was brilliant. He grew up in Chicago, brilliant at math, and he also had an aptitude, a wonderful aptitude, as teachers noted, not only for math, but for building bombs. He liked to do that. And he graduated early and went to Harvard, graduated from Harvard very early, and they got a PhD at the University of Michigan in mathematics. And in 1967, at the age of 24, I believe, he became the youngest ever professor of math at Berkeley, one of the most prestigious institutions in the United States. After 2 years, however, he clearly seemed to be losing it in some way. And so in 1969, without offering any explanation, he quit his job at Berkeley. He retreated then in 1970 and 1971 into a shack in Montana, and he began developing a critique of modern science and technology as something that required us to have to start blowing things up if we wanted to escape the dangers that science and technology posed to us. So he came up with the idea of creating bombs in letters and mailing them to representatives of the military-industrial complex. And he did that through the 1970s until he was caught in 1995, injuring dozens of people and killing 3 with his letter bombs. The targets of his letter bombs were university researchers who were part of what he considered to be the military-industrial complex that was killing people, airlines, and modern industry. He was known as the Unabomber because he targeted university and airline people, the Unabomber. So here he is, from his shack in Montana, sending out letters to representatives of the military-industrial complex and writing and thinking about this tract that he will write, which will do essentially what Marx tried to do in 1848, along with Engels, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto. He would write a manifesto that would make the people of the earth rise up against modern science and technology and kill all of its representatives. Purify everything. Wipe the slate clean and blank, as Rousseau had suggested, and then we could start over again. Here's one thing that he wrote reflecting this idea. In order to get our message before the public with some chance of making a lasting impression, we've had to kill people. We've had to kill people. Radical conclusion, the only way you can get your message across. Quote, in the same way, while the industrial system is sick, we must destroy it. If we compromise with it and let it recover from its sickness, it will eventually wipe out our freedom. So we have no choice. It's an either-or situation, zero-sum game. Either we destroy modern industry and society, or it destroys us. A radical conclusion from this critique I've been talking about of modern science and technology. Here he is in his home, devising his devices and his ideas. And then here is his famous manifesto, which you are reading for the course and will be discussing on the discussion board. He had developed this over a number of years, and in the 1990s he sent it to a number of the leading newspapers in the country. At that time, before internet, there were only a couple different ways that you could get to millions of people. And so he sent his screed, his critique, which you are reading, to the Washington Post and the New York Times. They had a decision to make, the editors. He said, look, if you publish my manifesto, I'll stop blowing people up. So they had to think, if we publish this and he inspires a bunch of people like him, we will have blood on our hands. On the other hand, if we don't publish this, we'll have blood on our hands because he will continue to kill people. At any rate, the Washington Post and the New York Times in 1995 decided, let's publish it. And Kaczynski's brother read this and he said, oh shit, I think I know who wrote this. This sounds just like my brother. Turned him into the FBI because he knew his brother was living like Henry David Thoreau and like Edward Abbey in the middle of nowhere in a shack in Montana. And he was arrested, tried and convicted, and he's now rotting for the rest of his life in a federal prison as we speak, as I speak right now. A couple other sort of footnotes here. There were other aspects of the radical environmental movement that's still with us today. People for the ethical treatment of animals, some representatives have drawn radical conclusions about the need to have to liberate animals from fur farming, to eliminate all animal testing for scientific research. They've concluded that meat is murder, just as some abortion opponents conclude that abortion is murder, and therefore anything is justified to prevent abortion. There are some who conclude that the attack on animals for purposes of eating meat is also murder, and anything is justified in order to prevent that murder from occurring. If you don't go vegetarian, we'll kill you. The conclusion that some have drawn. Chicks agree, boycott KFC, making their point in a radical way. And then we have the Animal Liberation Front and the Earth Liberation Front. terrorist organizations designated by the FBI in 2001 after 9/11 who are willing to do anything to protect this earth now threatened by our science and technology. They have that fist, and by the way, they borrow the image of the fist from the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 1970s, but in this case, it's by and large white people rising up in defense of Mother Earth is the thing that they're going to defend. And then here is just a list of some of their actions, inspired also, I should say, by Edward Abbey and his Monkey Wrench Gang, in which they are attacking symbols of modern civilization. And you can see a number of different actions that they had taken as of the point of this slide, which was a number of years ago. Similar, I should add, to, in some ways, bin Laden in 9/11, where what is it that bin Laden attacks? That symbol of American triumph, capitalism, science, and technology, the Twin Towers, which for their time when they were built in the 1970s were state-of-the-art building technology, embodying all the ideas of American technology, progress, and capitalism. So, there you have it, our critique of science and technology and how, at least on the part of some, that is taken as the foundation for radical, violent action in the birth of the modern environmental terrorist movement.